bent the wrong way, eyes rolling wildly in his head. His mouth was hanging open in a scream that he couldn't quite get out. Nikki still had one cuff around her right wrist, the swing arm on the left cuff dangling free. She swung the open cuff down on the man's face, and the exposed swing arm caught inside his cheek like a fishhook snagging a river trout. She yanked back on the cuff, and it tore through his cheek, widening his mouth by a good 2 inches. The man fell to the floor, writhing in pain. 2 other guards were charging her from the left. She swung the dangling handcuff at the closer of the two, catching him across the side of his face, dropping him to his knees. The other guard had his hands up like a boxer, ready to block her next swing. Nikki feinted with a backhand, then stopped midway through the arc and mule-kicked him in the balls. He doubled over with a gasp, and when the back of his head was exposed, she slammed the handcuff down, catching the swing arm around his ear and yanking back as hard as she could. The man barrel-rolled in midair, landed on his face, and didn't move. Nikki didn't know if he was dead or just passed out, and she didn't care. One of the guards yelled, "Beanbagger!" She spun around to face the rest of the guards and got a glimpse of a shotgun's muzzle blast. The round hit her in the stomach and doubled her over, the pain blindingly intense. Every muscle in her gut and her chest had constricted, and she couldn't breathe. She fought with her body to pull in the air she needed, but couldn't make it happen. All she managed was a thin, croaking groan. She coughed up blood on the floor, and a wave of dizzying nausea overtook her. She nearly fell over on her side. "Come on, kiddo," she told herself. "You gotta fight. Get up." She lifted her gaze to the narrowing circle of guards around her and tried to stand up straight. One of the guards racked a shotgun, and Nikki had just enough time to mentally brace herself when the second beanbag round hit her in the chest and dropped her to the ground, unconscious. When she awoke, one of the guards had her by the ankle and was dragging her across faded red carpet. "Stop," she said, still feeling groggy. Her vision was a blur. She tried to grab hold of something, anything, but the floor beneath her had been worn smooth, and all she managed to do was rake her fingernails across Berber. The guard glanced back when he felt her start to squirm, and jerked her leg even harder. "Fucking little bitch," he said. The side of his head was dark with a livid bruise and dried blood where the handcuffed swing arm had caught him. Beyond him was a large room. He was dragging her straight for it. "No," she said. "No, stop." "Stop my ass," he muttered. He reached the middle of the room and grabbed her ankle with both hands and flung her across the wooden floor. "Stay down, you little bitch," the guard said. She looked up at him in time to see his heel come crashing down on her face. And then her world went black again. Nikki hurt everywhere. She curled into a fetal ball and cried. She had never been hurt like this before. Every muscle ached, and her mouth was thick with a coppery taste of blood. The room was dark and heavy with the smell of rot. The floor beneath her was cold. She blinked the purple spots from her eyes and tried to peer into the darkness. She could see dim shapes, people, but couldn't make out details. "Hello?" she said, her voice coming out like a groan. Her call was met with a chorus of moans. The moans rose and fell in an uneven but urgent ululation that she had come to know all too well over the years. "No," she said, shaking her head. She pulled herself to her feet, forcing her way through the pain, pivoting around in a circle, waiting for the attack she knew was sure to come. The moaning grew louder and louder. The zombies in the dark were in a frenzy now. She heard the musical clinking of a chain-link fence. and in her mind she remembered visiting the St. Louis Zoo as a child, holding her father's hand as the two of them stared at a chimpanzee, shaking furiously at the bars of his cage with both hands. She was hearing the same kind of noise now, and knew there was a terrifying, frustrated, insatiable rage fueling it. But the question that mattered, indeed, the only question that really mattered, was which side of the cage was she on? Turning in a circle, she bumped into something heavy hanging from the ceiling. Her shoulder hit the bottom edge of the object, and it rocked away from her. It felt like a huge birdcage. And as soon as she moved it, the zombie inside it turned wild. Its moans rose from a fevered panting as the ghostly shape of its diseased arm shot out at her from between the bars. Nicky jumped back, her heart in her throat, her hand over her aching chest. "Oh, Jesus," she said. "Oh, Jesus, oh, Jesus." She staggered backward and fell, landing on her butt. She was surrounded, and for the first time in her life, she found that she couldn't make herself get back up. This was the end of the line. Her train stopped here. She was down in the bowels of the Zombie King's lair, and she was going to die here. The realization made her feel like she'd been run over by a truck. It flattened her, numbed her to the point that she was prepared to just let it happen. It wasn't scary anymore. All she had to do was sit still and wait for death to clamp its filthy jaws on her. She was crying, sobbing, when a series of bright lights came on. Black shirts, she realized, standing on the edge of the room holding hand-cranked spotlights. Nicky lifted her head and saw at once that she was in a large room, lined on either side by improvised cells constructed of chain-link fencing, strung over recessed chambers in the walls. Leering from behind the fencing were hundreds of zombies. They pressed against each other, clawed at each other's ruined faces, trying to squeeze through the diamond-shaped holes in the fence to get to her. And hanging from the ceiling were 3 large bell cages, each one containing a zombie. It was the middle cage she had run into. The zombie inside was on his knees, his face wedged between the bars, his hands reaching for her, clutching at the empty air between them. Its milky white eyes never blinked, never looked away from the vein throbbing in her neck. Horrified, she crawled away from it. A door at the far end of the room opened a moment later, and Lauren Skaggs, the Red Man, strode into the room. Instantly, the moaning stopped. A calm spread over the zombies, as each one focused on Lauren. He walked straight for her, stopping at her feet and looking down at her with a murderous hunger in his eyes. For a terrifying moment, Nicky wasn't sure if he intended to eat her or not. He just stood there, breathing heavily, watching her. "You're bleeding," he said at last. She didn't respond. "What? No nasty comeback? Where's the fire, Nicky? What happened to Nicky Booth, the ferocious zombie fighter?" "Your soldiers hurt me, Lauren," she said. It was suddenly very difficult to keep her eyes open. She wanted to pass out. "My soldiers haven't even started to hurt you, Nicky. The worst is yet to come. There's so much more." He knelt down so that he could look her in the eyes. "But you could stop that from happening. You know that, don't you? You could tell me where Don Fisher is. Tell me where he is, Nicky." "Or what?" Nicky said. Being threatened woke something primal in her, something that refused to be cowed by Lauren Skaggs. Zombie King or not, he was still the same old meth-head loser she'd known back in Gatling. "Or what, Lauren?" she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "What do you think you can do to me that will make me betray everything I've worked for?" He smiled.
Nicky, don't fool yourself. You're brave now. You're full of anger and meanness. You even dare to look me in the eye. But I can take away everything.
He motioned toward the wall of faces, watching them from between the bars.
Do you see them, Nicky? There's nothing behind those eyes but what I put there. They have no will but the purpose I put in their heads, and they will obey it, even if it means their own death. I can make you like that, Nicky. I can take away your very soul. And when I do, there will be nothing left inside but what I put there. I will own every inch of you. I will do everything I ever dreamed of back in school.
Go to hell, Lauren, she whispered. He laughed as he stood up straight.
Nicky, I heard you say earlier that I have gone insane. I don't think you've judged the situation right. You see, I can be reasonable.
What are you talking about?
I want Don Fisher. You know that. I know you can give him to me. And so, I propose to make a trade.
You've got nothing I want, Nicky said.
Oh, I think I do.
He walked over to the hanging cage and stuck his hand through the bars. He waved away the flies that swarmed around the zombie's sores. Then he turned back to Nicky.
I remember you back in high school, Nicky. You were everybody's darling, weren't you? A cheerleader, class valedictorian, volunteer at the Special Olympics. You were all kinds of hot shit.
The past is what it is, Lauren. We can't do anything about who we used to be.
That's true, he said. But the past can tell us about who we are now. It can tell us the kind of things we're likely to hold dear.
You're not making sense, Lauren.
Aren't I? No? Then let me put it to you this way. Tell me where Don Fisher is right now, or I will pull every zombie for 1,000 miles and use them to overrun Ken Stoller's compound. Is that plain enough for you? Every person you have come to care about, every man, woman, and child, will be gnawed to the bone. There will be nothing left of your home. What happened to Calamar? That will be a mercy killing compared to what I do to Union Field.
His face was lit with madness, and it rattled her. But it wasn't the looming threat of his red body that frightened her. No, it was more than that. She had been a member of Union Field since she was 22. Ken Stoller had taken a nearly wild young woman in charge of a 12-year-old little girl and turned her into a leader among men. She had made friends there. No, don't mince words, she thought. They're your family. The people there in Stoller's compound had become her family. Her recent fights and falling out with Stoller were beside the point. They didn't change anything, at least not where it counted. When she left Union Field, she left a lot more than a safe haven. She left her family. And the idea of Lauren's zombies killing them, improbable as it was, rattled her to the core. Do whatever you're going to do, she said, praying that he would believe her. I've got nothing there anymore. A sneer played at the corner of his mouth.
You fight better than you lie, Nicky. I know what you're really thinking. You're scared, but not scared enough. You don't think I can make good on my promise, and that's why you think you can lie to me. You've seen, what, 100, 200 zombies? You think that is all I control. You're wrong, Nicky. I control them all. Have you ever watched an enormous flock of birds in flight? Seen the way they wheel and turn like one mind is working them all? It's morphic fields. I don't know how, but I can see those fields. It's like a fog that I can move and push. I can control it.
He gestured to the zombies behind the chain-link fencing.
I can control all of them without making a sound.
You believe that? Lauren, you really are insane.
Nicky,
he said, shaking his head.
You haven't been paying attention. I know you've seen a quiet street suddenly fill with zombies. You've seen that, right? You've seen one zombie turn into a stadium full of them in the blink of an eye. Haven't you ever wondered how that happened? How they converge on a victim so suddenly, so completely?
She didn't answer.
Yes, you have, haven't you? I can see it in your face. You're wondering how it happens, but I know the answer, Nicky. I know because I can see what connects them. I can make them do anything, go anywhere, and I can do it without ever leaving this room.
I don't believe you.
Like calls to like, Nicky. A virus will invade a host, but it won't make its presence known until it has sufficient numbers to control the host. We've known that for a long time, even though we've never understood how it works. I still don't. But I can use it, Nicky. If I concentrate, I can make a zombie in Los Angeles walk into the Pacific Ocean. I can make a crowd of them in Mexico City come north. Viruses are like that. No matter where they are in the host, they can communicate. It's not telepathy, or pheromones, or any of that shit. But it happens just the same.
He stopped there, watching her.
You know what I think you need, he said. You need a demonstration.
He didn't take his eyes off her. He didn't do anything but stand there. And yet, somehow he delivered a message to the zombie behind her. It suddenly slammed itself against the bars of its cage, snarling, pounding on the metal. She staggered to her feet and turned to watch it. The zombie tried to tear a strip of iron with its teeth. He clamped down on the metal and tore at it, even after shattering its teeth. And when that didn't work, it jammed a shoulder into the gap and pressed hard. An uninfected person would have given up. But the zombie pushed and pushed until it bent the bars, stripping the flesh from its shoulder as it forced itself out of its cage. "Oh, my God," Nicky said, backing up.
He left here a long time ago, Nicky.
She turned to look at the red man. He smiled back, then gestured toward the cage. One of the strips of iron snapped from its rivet and clattered to the floor. The zombie, a huge flap of bloody skin hanging loose from its shoulder, slid through the newly opened gap and dropped face first to the floor, its right arm snapping beneath it. With its skin hanging down around its waist like a skirt, the zombie rose to its feet.
"No,"
Nicky said.
"No." That's a man, she thought. How can he still be alive?
It took a few faltering steps toward her, smearing the ground with blood. The zombie was less than 5 feet from her when it stopped and turned its diseased face toward the red man. It was swaying in a circular motion, barely able to keep its feet.
He will walk 1,000 miles more if I want him to, the red man said.
"Lauren, stop it, please."
"Then tell me where I can find Don Fisher."
"Herculaneum," she said. her voice barely more than a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to look at anything but her own boots. All the fight had bled out of her. "I was supposed to meet him in Herculaneum this morning. He's probably still there." The red man smiled.
"Better and better, Nicky. My zombies will move through Union Field, and then we will go looking for Dr. Fisher."
"What?" she said, aware of the fear in her voice, but unable to stop it.
"You can't. You said you just wanted Fisher." "I do want Fisher, Nicky. And when you're ready to give him to me, I'll take him. But you're still lying to me. You have 3 days to give me what I want. It will take at least that long for my zombies to gather at Union Field. If I have not heard the truth by then, it won't matter. Not for you or for Fisher."
With that, he turned and strode out of the room. And when the black shirts turned out the lights, the only sound she heard was the exhausted breathing of the dying zombie on the floor, just a few feet away. Chapter 15. It was shortly after daybreak, and the light was struggling to break through the mists and white vapors that clung to the marshlands on the Illinois side of the river. Though he had been in good spirits as they powered away from Herculaneum, a night of rain that had never really been more than a thick, cold mist had left Jimmy Hinton feeling sober and uneasily alert. As soon as possible, for fuel was worth almost as much as blood these days, he'd cut the motor and let them drift downriver along the Illinois side, where they were less likely to encounter any patrols from Ken Stoller's compound. He knew it was unlikely Stoller's goons would come this far, for they were rapidly approaching the Red Man's domain. But one could never tell what Stoller might do. The man was an enigma. So they went on through the drizzly, miserable night, and for a while they traveled parallel to a dirt road that ran along the riverbank. They hid whenever possible in the thick, overhanging cottonwoods, because the banks were crawling with the infected, moving south through the streams of mist, as though they were responding to some kind of migratory impulse, a Pied Piper call that only they could hear. Several times they turned as a body to regard the Sugar Jane as it drifted past, and on one such occasion the sight of all those eyes glinting in the darkness had been enough to drive a half-drunk Richardson down into the cabin, muttering something about apex predators. Now, Jimmy Hinton was alone once more, regarding the feeble morning light and the white, cloud-like puffs of mist and fog that drifted like wraiths through the stands of rushes and out over the wetlands. The place was utterly desolate and darkly sinister, with the threat of the infected lurking somewhere out there, their hungry moans echoing through the night. He had pulled the Sugar Jane into the dead water under a towhead and broke up the outline of her hull with cottonwoods and young willow branches, like a latter-day Huck Finn. The process took a lot of work, especially for a man his age, but the unusually large amount of northbound river traffic they'd seen, and his jangled nerves, in his mind, justified the added caution. On a normal night, with the darkness so complete that you couldn't see the water when you looked over the railing, it wasn't unusual to hear the Bedouins on other boats beating on pots and pans or calling out to each other in friendly salutations. They'd touch off a candle and raise a light to each other as they passed. It was the custom of the river. It was good etiquette. But there had been none of that on this trip. In fact, a day before, just hours after they'd hustled away from Ken Stoller's people up in Herculaneum, they'd seen a trawler much like their own steadily chugging upriver. Jimmy had hailed the pilot, a thin, bald black man, with a friendly wave. But one look at the stark and strangely haunted emptiness in the man's eyes had caused the smile to shrink from Jimmy's face and his hand to fall to his side, his fingers curled into his palm as though to pull the hail back from whence it had come. Jimmy had stared after the man as they passed. his face a pale yellow in the guttering candlelight, and the man had stared back at him, never saying a word. The man's haunted expression never wavered, and it had unnerved Jimmy in a way that he couldn't quite identify. Since that disturbing moment, he'd seen a steady stream of traffic moving upriver. There had been other encounters that were equally unsettling, and those encounters, coupled with the crowds of infected moving south through the desolate Illinois swamps, had prompted him to take to hiding in the daylight, as they were doing now, moving only when they had the cover of darkness to conceal them. He wasn't sure exactly what was going on, but he had survived a long time by listening to the warning bells in his head, and they had been ringing loudly since that first encounter with the black man with the haunted eyes. Pausing to look over the screen of tree branches he'd made, his mind wandered, as it sometimes did, back to the time before the outbreak, and for one glorious moment he could once again sense the intoxicating smell of his infant granddaughter, and hear the infectious burbling of her laughter. Warmth spread through his chest. His world was perfect, inviolate, his spirit soaring on a thermal uplift of a memory so complete it eclipsed everything else around him. And then, the sound of a motor somewhere out on the expanse of the river knifed through the happy shell of his daydream, and his eyes opened to the misery of the present. "I love you, baby," he said, fetching a deep sigh. "I miss you." And then he went below. Jimmy Hinton stopped at the bottom of the stairs and surveyed the cabin. Gabby was sitting on the couch. The fat girl, Avery Harper, was seated on the floor between Gabby's knees. Gabby was combing the girl's hair and laughing at something the older woman, the college professor, had just said. He almost asked Gabby to come topside and help square away the deck, just in case the mist actually turned into rain. But seeing her with the other women, talking, laughing, he realized it had been too long since she'd shared a little friendly conversation with another woman. Poor thing didn't have anybody else but him to talk to most of the time, and Jimmy knew he wasn't that entertaining. Off to his left, Richardson and Nate Royal were huddled together, talking about something on Richardson's iPad. The two of them had been thick as thieves since they'd left Herculaneum, Richardson teaching the kid how to use the device. "I got us hid pretty good," Jimmy announced to the room. "There's still a bunch of northbound traffic on the river, but they ain't going to be able to see us. Same with the zombies. They'll probably stick to the road, and it cuts east of here to miss the wetlands." Gabby favored him with a smile, but her attention never really left the other two women. Richardson and Nate didn't even look up. "Good to know you people appreciate my efforts," Jimmy said. He surveyed the room again, waiting for somebody to acknowledge him, but nobody did. Finally, Gabby looked over at him.
"Quit hovering, Jimmy. Why don't you take a nap? Take your hush puppies off and sleep a little. I bet your feet are hurting."
She turned to Sylvia and said,
"It's the gout, you know. We keep looking for Epsom salt for him to soak his feet, but nobody seems to have it."
"Can't you improvise something?" Sylvia asked. "Baking soda, maybe?"
"Well, I don't know. You think that'd work?"
Jimmy opened his mouth to argue, but shut it without saying a word. They had already tuned him out anyway. And besides, Gabby was right, as always. He was exhausted. His feet were killing him, especially his ankles, and the bunk did look inviting. He slipped off his hush-puppies, the gentle vibration of the deck soothing the soles of his feet, and walked over to the sink for a cup of water. Richardson and Nate were still murmuring over the iPad. Jimmy caught a flash of a home movie on it. A pretty girl in a simple white cotton dress, teaching a group of children. "I'll bet you recognize her, don't you?" Richardson said to Nate. There was a touch of mischief in his expression. Nate squinted at the dim, grimed-over screen, frowning in concentration. But then his lips spread open, revealing badly yellowed teeth.
"Hey, is that—"
"Uh-huh. Bellamy Blaze.
No shit.
Nate let out a whistle.
You're not shitting me, are you? You met her?
I thought you'd like that. For a moment, there was genuine mirth in Richardson's voice, but it faded quickly. He looked at the screen and his smile turned sad. Her real name was Robin Thorpe. She was one of the ones who escaped the grasslands with me. Smart lady. A natural when it came to teaching kids. Nate laughed.
That girl could swallow a 9-inch cock and smile while she did it. Before the outbreak, I think I had all her movies. Me and her and a case of beer spent a lot of quality time together on my couch, if you get my drift.
Richardson nodded. He seemed to be looking inwardly now, staring back across years. She was a good friend, he said. A good leader, too.
Did you ever—
Nate made that hitching noise again.
You know, tell me you hit that.
No, Nate, nothing like that. She was devoted to this guy named Jeff Stavers. Jeff was a Harvard grad, but he was working as a video store manager right before the outbreak. You would have liked him, I think. Richardson turned back to the iPad. You know what I remember about her? Nate shook his head. Do you remember me telling you about Ed Moore and how he led us all out of the grasslands? Well, when Ed died, it was Robin here who took up the reins. Not only was she the school teacher for our compound, but she was also our leader. She did a hell of a job, too. Richardson shook his head. Absently, he ran a finger down the side of the iPad. I miss her, Nate. She tried so hard. What happened wasn't her fault. I remember when we came back and found everybody dead. Those of us who were still alive really leaned on her after that. She was just a whale of energy. Up before everyone else. Didn't get to bed until way after everyone else was already in bed, exhausted. But you know what she told me that really impressed me?
No. What?
She said that the outbreak was the best thing that ever happened to her, because it let her start her life all over again. That's what I wanted to show you, Nate. I think you can probably identify with that, can't you? Jimmy didn't hear the kid's reply. He was watching the woman on the iPad screen. She was making a dozen little kids laugh over something they just read. Jimmy cocked his head to one side, studying the image. He could see it now. She really was Bellamy Blaze, the porn star. A little older, maybe, a little worn down by the weight of leadership. But it really was her. He remembered watching her videos on the internet. The girl bent over the arm of a couch while 3 guys with huge dicks took turns going at her ass like it was a punching bag. He felt uncomfortable. Sad, somehow. It wasn't her sexual exploits that held his attention. It was the children giggling. The sound filled him with sadness. "You're wasting your time with that shit," Jimmy said. Both Nate and Richardson looked up at him.
You said that before, Nate said. You don't like hearing stories about how people came through the outbreak. Why not?
Jimmy regarded him, amazed once again at the people who managed to live through the apocalypse, and mourning those who didn't. This guy, he was bland and uninteresting, dumb as the day was long, and yet he was still alive. There didn't seem to be any justice in it. "Ain't nothing good about what's gone, kid," Jimmy said. "It ain't coming back, so what's the point?" "But that is the point," Richardson said. "So much of everything is gone, both the good and the bad." "That doesn't answer my question," Jimmy said. "Look at us. Look at what we got here. Ain't none of us what we used to be. Ain't none of us got what we used to have. There's no point in reminding us of how bad things are. You think that's what I'm doing by saving these stories? Isn't it? Tell me." You ever brought back one moment of happiness by saving up all these stories? Have you? Seems to me all you're doing is dredging up a lot of pointless heartache. Richardson put his iPad down on the deck. Nate started to speak, but Richardson put a hand on his shoulder and quieted him with a gentle smile. "It's okay," he said to Nate. Then he looked up at Jimmy and said, "Storytelling isn't about bringing back the past, though you're right about everything else you said. There's nothing in these files that will undo what's been done. The world's not what it is. There's no changing that. So what's the point? Why bother? You're old enough you should know better than to add cruelty to a world that's already got too much of it." "Yeah? And you're old enough not to believe that." Jimmy let out a huff, unimpressed. "Do yourself a favor, kid," he said to Nate, "and get yourself a new teacher. This one ain't got enough sense to pour piss out of a boot if the directions were written on the heel." Richardson laughed. "What's so funny?" Jimmy challenged him. "That was one of my dad's favorites," he said. "That, and you're running off the reservation. I used to love all the shit my dad used to say." Jimmy stared at him for a long moment. "Yeah, well, we old folks are great for that." "And yet you totally missed my point," Richardson said. "You're wrong when you said all I was doing was adding cruelty to the world." He held up the iPad. "That's not what this is. This right here, this is how we rebuild. These stories, this is how we make the world anew. Storytelling is our therapy. It's where we go for healing." "Spare me the lit lecture, Professor." "That's her job," Richardson said with a grin as he hooked his thumb in Sylvia Carnes's direction. "I'm a reporter by trade. My job is to find the thread that connects us. And stories do that." Jimmy was unimpressed. He loosened his belt and untucked his shirt and dropped down onto his bunk. Suddenly he didn't feel at all tired. He felt angry. But not at Ben Richardson, not at any of them. He was angry at himself, angry at his life, angry at everything that had turned out so god-awful wrong. "I'll tell you what's obvious," he said. His comment was directed at Richardson, but he was staring up at the ceiling. "Humanity was made to suffer. There is no saving us. You're preaching a fairy tale. The world was made with more cruelty than kindness, and the scales won't ever balance." "Do you really believe that?" Nate asked. In the morning light that was quickly spreading through the cabin, his face looked far younger than it had when Jimmy first met him. "Yeah, I do," said Jimmy. "Now let me alone. I'm going to bed." And with that he turned his face to the wall and pulled the covers up to his ears. Nate woke to the sound of splashing. He blinked his eyes and listened. The cabin was in darkness. From the couch where he had fallen asleep, he could see a light rain falling on the windows. It was dark beyond the windows. The splashing was muffled, but constant, and it sounded like it was getting closer. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he climbed the stairs up to the deck and saw Jimmy Hinton, his wife, and Avery Harper near the front of the boat, looking toward the Illinois side of the river. Ben Richardson and Sylvia Carnes were in the back of the boat. Nate couldn't see them back there, but he could hear them, rummaging through their packs. The splashing continued. Nate rose to his tiptoes and tried to peer over the edge. All he could see was darkness, and here and there, overlapping rings in the water from the rain. "What's going on?" he said. "Shut up!" Jimmy hissed at him. The old man gave him a hard look that Nate didn't feel like challenging. Only then did he notice the long, hooked pole that Jimmy Hinton was holding. The hooked end looked dark and wet. Slowly, quietly, moving in a crouch, Nate crossed the deck and knelt down next to Avery Harper. "Hey," he whispered. "Hi," she said.
Be quiet, okay?
She pointed toward the Illinois shore with a chubby finger. Nate followed the line of her finger, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. He shrugged and turned back to her, but before he could speak, he saw a shape, a man's back, bobbing in the dark water below them. The man's arms were at his side, his face turned down into the depths. As Nate watched, the dead man's shoulder hit the prow of the boat and turned in a slow pirouette before slipping into the weeds along the bank.
Zombie?
He asked. Avery nodded, her lower lip between her teeth. In the darkness, her eyes had a glassy shine. She was actually kind of pretty, Nate thought. There was a softness to her, an innocence that made him feel strong, like he could be something meaningful for her. And he liked that. He liked the way she looked at him.
It was close,
she said, still whispering.
That one there climbed up the side of the boat. If Jimmy hadn't been here, there's no telling what would have happened.
There's more out there, Jimmy said. The way he held that long boathook reminded Nate of the Indians he'd seen in the old westerns, the way they'd kneel on a ridgeline and watch the cowboys riding through the valley down below.
You can hear 'em splashing. You sure it's zombies?
Nate asked.
Course I'm sure, you jackass. Who the fuck you think it is?
Jimmy stroked his chin with a free hand. His eyes focused on something Nate couldn't see out there in the dark. He turned to Nate.
Make yourself useful, kid. Run back there and find out how they're doing with those rifles. I want 2 of them back there and 2 up here. You got that?
Yeah, Nate said.
Yeah, sure. Move, but be quiet about it.
Nate scrambled aft. He found Ben Richardson and Sylvia Collins, each with a rifle slung over their shoulder. They were digging through their backpacks.
Jimmy says he needs 2 rifles up front, Nate said. They're right there behind you, Sylvia said. We're trying to find magazines.
Nate turned, but he couldn't see very well in the dark. He was standing on a large coil of rope and some kind of bag. The boat was rocking with the current. It wasn't much, but between the darkness and the uneven footing, it was enough to make it hard to move, and when he saw the rifles and reached for them, he pitched forward and slipped. Instinctively he tried to grasp at the wall. His hand hit something solid. It felt like a lamp of some kind, and knocked it to the deck. It hit with a muffled clank, a noise that reminded him of an aluminum bat hitting a baseball, and then shattered.
Oh, shit, Nate said.
For a long moment there was no sound. The air around him seemed to go preternaturally quiet. A light breeze touched his face, cool and scented with the heavy but still pleasant scent of the river and the overhanging cottonwoods. Nate looked down at the shattered glass and blunt piece of brass at his feet. His mind felt hazy and numb, like he was experiencing déjà vu, though he knew that wasn't what this was. This was the way he had felt in the time before the outbreak, the way he felt when he fucked up bad when someone else was counting on him. There had been a lot of times like that in the time before, but none recently. Not while he was living and traveling on his own, when he had no one else to blame for his mistakes but himself. He turned his gaze on Richardson, who was staring at him with rheumy, soul-sick eyes. Something was haunting Ben Richardson, a fatigue so complete it seemed to invade his body like a cancer, and it scared the crap out of Nate Royal.
I'm sorry,
he said. Richardson never had the chance to reply. From somewhere out on the water, there came a moan, a deep, ululating sound that was full of hunger and pain and blind rage. Suddenly, the water was alive with splashing.
What the hell?
Jimmy Hinton called out.
We need those rifles, now!
Go, Richardson said. Take 'em and go. Nate didn't waste any more time. He grabbed a rifle in each hand and scrambled forward. Jimmy Hinton was already on his feet, the boat hook discarded, and grabbed the rifles from him as soon as he rounded the cabin.
Give me those,
he said. He snatched the rifles from Nate's hands and tossed one to Gabby. She caught it and spun around toward the water, the rifle already seated in the crotch of her shoulder and cheek. There was a rustling in the cottonwoods in front of him.
"Right there,"
Avery said, pointing.
"I got it,"
Gabby said. And no sooner had she spoken when a zombie stepped into sight, his hands slapping at the screen of branches in front of his face. The zombie was covered in swamp mud. The yellow glow of his eyes stood out against the mud, as did his blood-stained teeth. Raindrops spattered against his face, and Nate had just enough time to realize that the zombie was freshly turned before Gabby opened fire. The man's head exploded like a punctured water balloon, clotted chunks of gore splashing into the water behind it. The body dropped a moment later. "I got movement back here," Richardson shouted, and the call was followed a second later by the rattle of his AR-15.
"There,"
Avery shouted, pointing over the side. Jimmy Hinton pushed Nate to one side with a hard shoulder shuck. Nate started to protest, but closed his mind before he spoke. Jimmy and Gabby Hinton knelt down next to each other and started firing at the infected that were coming through the cottonwoods. There were dozens of them, and Jimmy and Gabby laid into them with a steady stream of fire, churning the water to a froth as the bullets tore into the zombies and sent them convulsing into the water. Watching the husband and wife work, Nate was reminded of the Air Force guards back at Minot when the infected broke into the hospital where he was held captive during the 6 months or so following the outbreak. For a kid who got his military education watching Arnold Schwarzenegger fight the Predator, the kind of teamwork he'd seen from real soldiers had seemed anticlimactic, like there was almost no drama in it. It was just simple and businesslike and to the point. It was tactics over snappy one-liners, a group effort instead of a one-man show. Jimmy and his wife did it the same way. They covered each other during reloads. They conserved their shots. It was more than just turning the rifle loose and spraying and praying. They were always under absolute control. And when the last shell casing clinked against the fiberglass deck of the boat, and Gabby's call of, "Clear this side," was answered the same way from Jimmy, the water around the prow of the boat was choked with the dead, the bodies leaking blood into the black water. Gabby lowered her weapon, then turned to Avery.
"Are you okay, sweetie?"
Avery nodded.
"How about you?"
Nate was still looking at the bodies floating in the water. They had killed at least 20, and it had taken them less than a minute to do it.
"Nate?"
"What?" he said, turning back to Gabby.
"Are you okay?"
"Uh-huh." Jimmy rose to his feet. He surveyed the dead bodies down in the water, and when he was satisfied that none of them were still moving, he called aft to Richardson.
"You guys okay back there?"
"We're clear back here," Richardson said.
"Okay. One of you stay back there as watch. The other come forward."
A moment later, Sylvia Carnes appeared. She still had the rifle in her hands. She pushed her way past Nate and went straight to Avery and hugged the girl.
"We're gonna have to hustle out of here,"
Jimmy said.
"But we can't,"
Gabby said.
"The river traffic." "We can't stay here. What would you have me do?" "I don't know. Find a place somewhere. Maybe cross to the Missouri side. There's less cover over there, but—"
"But what?"
"We've got to stay hidden,"
Gabby said. Her voice had taken on a high-pitched, plaintive note that to Nate sounded an awful lot like panic. It was the first time since he woke up that he felt like somebody else was as confused and frightened as he was, and it didn't make him feel any better.
"I don't get it,"
he blurted out.
"What's going on? Why can't we just take off? I mean, there's going to be more of those things, right?"
"Maybe," Jimmy said.
"Probably, actually. You saw those ones we just dealt with. Those were all Stage 1 zombies, freshly turned. They wouldn't get this far into the wetlands unless they were down here already."
"I don't get it," Nate said.
"What does that mean?"
"You're saying there are Stage 2 or Stage 3 zombies out there somewhere?" Sylvia said. "What are you thinking? That maybe those zombies got a hold of a boat nearby and turned the crew?"
"That'd be my guess.
Jimmy answered, nodding to himself.
Well, that's bad,
Nate said.
What are we waiting for? Let's shove off.
Haven't you been listening? Gabby said. We've had northbound traffic all over this river since we left Herculaneum. That's not normal. All those people, they're fleeing from something. If we head out onto the river, we're likely to run across that northbound traffic.
So? Nate said. Nate, Sylvia said, and pulled Avery Harper to her chest.
Where do you think those people are going? They're running from something. Who do you think they'll turn to for protection?
Not really knowing what to say, Nate shrugged, his gaze wandering over the faces around him, and finally setting on Avery.
Ken Stola's troops are that way,
Avery said.
Nate, we can't let them see us. If they find us, do you have any idea what they'll do to us? They think we're traitors. They'll kill us. If we don't find Nicky, then all of this will be for nothing. I can't let that happen. I just can't. Do you understand that?
Nate's mouth twitched in a gesture that looked something like a smile, but was really the awkwardness and discomfort inside him trying to work its way to the surface. But Avery didn't look away. He nodded. The next instant, Jimmy Hinton pushed Nate to one side and charged up to the flybridge. He fed the throttle enough to turn the boat out of the cottonwoods and get them chugging out toward mid-river. In the darkness, the river seemed strange, ominous. In the daylight, it was wide open, the far bank, when it was visible at all, a lush tropical green. Staring at it, Nate had the feeling he was part of something vast and slow and ageless. Its power was suggestive, as though he could tap into it if only he could discover the right mystical combination of peace and concentration. But it was a far more sinister and constricting world at night. The darkness had a way of enveloping him, like a large snake slowly tightening its coils around his chest, choking off his air. It frightened him.
Keep your ears open, Gabby said. Anybody hears anything, say something.
Nate turned to the darkness and listened. He couldn't hear anything but the low, gurgling rumble of the Sugar Jane's engine. 2 minutes slipped by with him leaning over the railing, listening intently, before Jimmy Hinton cut the engine. A sudden silence dropped over all of them as the boat began to drift downstream.
There,
Avery said.
Do you hear that?
They all listened.
I don't hear anything,
Nate said. Gabby silenced him with a look. Chastened, Nate turned back to the darkness. And that's when he heard it. It was another boat, the engines off, the waves lapping against its hull.
You kids get down,
Gabby said. She lowered herself down behind the Sugar Jane's gunwale and adjusted the rifle against her cheek. The sound was getting closer. Nate could hear it clearly now, the rhythmic slapping of water against a drifting hull. Staring up at Gabby, he held his breath as he waited for her to shoot. But she didn't fire. Instead, Nate saw the weapon sag in her hands. She rose part of the way to her feet, murmuring,
"Oh, my God! Oh, my sweet God!"
The boat, a lot smaller than the Sugar Jane, was resolving out of the darkness as Nate stood up. And right away he saw what was wrong. The boat was drifting backward with the river current. There were 5 or 6 bodies on the deck, all of them dead. Blood dripped off the side of the boat and down its hull toward the water. Scanning the deck, Nate saw a hand with no arm attached, palm up, the fingers curled in on itself. It reminded Nate of a bug on its back. It took him a moment longer to realize that the body next to the hand was still moving. The zombie was on its knees, its back to them. It was feeding out of the belly of one of the corpses. Nate groaned. It was a sight he had witnessed hundreds of times since the outbreak, but the sight of it, the smell of a dead man's bowels opened, was something he never got used to. At the sound of Nate's groan, the zombie rose to its feet, turned, and stared at them. It let out a stuttering moan as its hands came up, the fingers clutching for them, completely ignorant of the gap between them. It was a freshly turned zombie, like the ones they'd encountered in the cottonwood grove on the Illinois bank, and its glazed-over eyes showed only an empty pit leading straight into nothingness. Before any of them could react, answering moans rose up from the bank behind them. Nate turned to the sound. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jimmy doing the same thing.
"Shoot him," Jimmy said. "Stop him before he attracts more."
"I got him," Gabby said, and raised her rifle and fired a single round, cutting off the moan in the zombie's throat. The next few hours were tense ones for Nate. Though Jimmy Hinton did his best to avoid Nate, it was a small boat, and they did bump into each other. It couldn't be helped. And when they did, Nate could see the simmering anger in Jimmy's eyes. He would squeeze up against the wall of the cabin to let Jimmy pass and mutter, "Sorry, and Jimmy would grunt something inaudible in reply and move on. Nothing was said, but the incident with the broken lantern was still very much between them. And so it was with more than a little trepidation that Nate climbed the stairs to the deck to see how far off the morning was. The mist that had been threatening to turn into rain over the last day and a half had finally succeeded, and the darkness swirled with silvery curtains of rain. Jimmy and Gabby had stretched a blue tarp over the forward section of the deck, and the rain sizzled and popped against it. Nate could see Jimmy and Gabby sitting in lawn chairs next to the railing up near the prow, Gabby with a rifle across her ample thighs. Avery Harper was sitting off to his left, watching a coffee pot steam on a camper stove.
"That smells good,"
he said.
"You got any left?"
She smiled at him, and it was such an innocent, sweet gesture that he couldn't help but smile back. At least she didn't want to throw him overboard.
"I think maybe I made it a little strong," she said. "Don't apologize. I like my coffee strong."
She poured him a cup and watched him as he blew the steam from the cup and sipped it. She looked on the verge of wincing at some expected criticism.
"Well?"
He tried to keep on smiling, but the coffee was the worst thing he had ever tasted, and he had put away some pretty nasty attempts at coffee in his time. This was even worse than the shoe leather and chicory root combination he'd had outside of Memphis a few years back. It was thick as sludge and tasted like burned cooking grease. He couldn't stop his mouth from puckering.
"You don't like it, do you?"
"No," he said, coughing.
"It's okay. It's too strong, isn't it? I've never made it before. Usually Sylvia or Nicky does it. When we can get it, that is."
Nate set his cup down on the deck.
"You go way back with them, don't you?" "With Nicky and Sylvia?" "Yeah. They're my family, Nate. Nicky raised me since I was 10. My own mom died before the outbreak. Nicky and Sylvia have been like mothers to me."
Nodding, Nate picked up his coffee.
"Look, would you mind if I, poured this out?"
She smiled.
"Go ahead. I saw Jimmy pour his over the side when he thought I wasn't looking."
"Okay," he said, chuckling at the image that popped into his head of Jimmy trying to sneak the stuff away without being seen. She was looking at him again, with that mixture of innocence and trust, an obvious attraction that quickened something inside him. The more time he spent with her, the more he liked her.
"You mind if I ask you a question?"
"No," she said. "Anything."
"Why are you here, Avery? I get why Sylvia's here. I even get why I'm here, sort of. But you're a mystery to me. What are you doing here?"
She didn't even hesitate.
"Because I believe in Nicky, Nate. Haven't you been listening? She is everything to me. Without her, I'd be dead. Oh, I might have gone on living, but inside, I'd be dead. She did more than take me in."
She smiled, and for a moment Her eyes shone with the light of admiration.
You should hear her talk. How passionate she is about saving what's left of this world. Every time I hear her speak, I feel this chill. She's like a battery. Do you know what I mean? When you stand next to her, you can feel the energy coming out of her. It's impossible to be around her and not feel like the world is worth saving.
Nate didn't answer her back. He nodded, but inside he was doubtful that Nicky had done Avery any favors. Most of the people who had survived this long had developed a hard inner grain of resiliency. But Avery seemed soft. He liked that about her, but it worried him too. Was she too much in Nicky's service? Anybody who relied so heavily on another to define them couldn't be entirely healthy, could they?
Avery, honey.
It was Gabby. Both Nate and Avery stared up at her. The woman had a wonderfully comfortable smile when she wanted to, like a friendly grandmother. At least Nate imagined it as a grandmotherly smile. He had never known his.
I'm going to go down to the galley and cook up some eggs. You want to join me?
Avery looked at Nate, and he smiled and shrugged.
Okay,
Avery said.
Yeah, sure.
When the women went downstairs, Nate turned toward the prow and saw Jimmy Hinton still sitting there, staring off into the darkness.
Jimmy?
Jimmy looked up over his shoulder at Nate and grunted.
You mind if I sit down?
I don't care. Do whatever you're going to do.
Nate sat down in the chair Gabby had just vacated, and tried to see what Jimmy saw when he looked out into the pre-dawn darkness that covered the river and its environs. But whatever the man saw there was a mystery to him.
You don't like me very much, do you?
Nate said. Jimmy slowly turned to him, his mouth pinched together like a man who keeps getting interrupted every time he sits down to read the morning paper, and said,
Nate, I'll be honest with you. I've flushed turds smarter than you. I think an awful lot of good, intelligent folks have died since the outbreak, and it breaks my heart sometimes looking at the folks God decided was good enough to go on living.
Nate cleared his throat. He wasn't mad. He'd never had any illusions about the brains he'd been given, and he actually found it refreshing to hear people talk about his lack of smarts. There was something honest in it.
I guess that's fair,
he said.
I'm sorry if I'm not the man that whoever you lost was.
Jimmy turned to him. He was frowning at first, but then the frown turned into a slow smile.
It was a woman, actually. My daughter. And my granddaughter.
I'm sorry.
Me too.
Jimmy didn't look away. He looked Nate over, then hooked a thumb toward the cabin.
You're kind of sweet on that girl, aren't you?
A little,
Nate said.
What do you think? You think I got a chance there?
A chance? I don't know. Maybe. Women are idiots, you know.
That made Nate laugh.
I haven't found that to be true.
No, I reckon not. I imagine you've met dead dogs with more brains than you got. It's true, though. Women are idiots. Nate, you ever looked at a man? I mean, really looked at him? You ever put yourself in a woman's mind and wondered why she'd ever want to fuck something that looked like an anemic pink gorilla? Look at a woman. She's got all those curves, all those beautiful curves. She's got breasts. She's got hips that feel like the steering wheel of a brand new Buick. She looks like a fucking piece of art in blue jeans. Hell, she even smells nice. Then look at a man. He's all angles and dangling parts. He looks ridiculous. He farts. He scratches his ass. He'll live like a billy goat if you let him. I tell you, the only real mystery in life is why every woman on this planet isn't a lesbian.
Jimmy laughed. He picked at a piece of skin at the corner of his thumbnail and flicked it over the side.
And don't even get me started on the actual act of sex, he said suddenly.